In the coming weeks, 6 men will face the ultimate sentence, death. For decades, their names have been etched into the cold walls of death row, each one carrying a story of violence, loss, and justice. But what happens when the final countdown begins? Behind every scheduled execution is a complex web of crime, court battles, appeals, and moral questions that refuse to die. Stay with us as we uncover these stories in depth. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel so you won't miss our next jaw-dropping upload. Case 1, Gregory Hunt, Alabama. Gregory Hunt's story begins in the heart of Alabama, where he was born and raised in a modest household marked by hardship and instability. Growing up in the 1960s and 70s, Hunt faced the challenges that often accompany poverty, broken family ties, limited educational opportunities, and a community grappling with social and economic upheaval. Despite these difficulties, Hunt's early years were relatively unremarkable, but by his late teens his life took a downward turn shaped by poor decisions and troubled relationships. One of those relationships was with Karen Lane, a woman Hunt briefly dated in the late 1980s. Their connection was turbulent and brief, marked by arguments and emotional strain. On an autumn day in 1988, this volatile relationship reached a devastating climax. Karen Lane was found dead under violent circumstances, the crime scene painting a grim picture of what had occurred. Investigators discovered evidence of a struggle and blunt force trauma, indicating a brutal attack. Authorities quickly focused their attention on Gregory Hunt as the prime suspect. The legal proceedings began in earnest in 1990. Hunt was charged with the murder of Karen Lane, a first-degree murder case that would test the prosecution's ability to prove intent and guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The courtroom drama unfolded with the presentation of forensic evidence, witness testimony, and detailed accounts of Hunt's relationship with Lane. The prosecution painted a picture of a man driven to violence, while the defense argued mitigating factors, including Hunt's troubled upbringing and the complexities of his relationship with the victim. After days of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned a verdict of guilty on all counts. The sentencing phase was swift. Hunt was sentenced to death, a decision reflecting the gravity of the crime and the state's stringent approach to capital punishment. The presiding judge underscored the severity of the offense, affirming the need for the ultimate penalty. For more than 3 decades, Gregory Hunt remained on Alabama's death row. His case became emblematic of ongoing debates about justice and capital punishment. But what makes Hunt's story particularly notable today is the method by which Alabama plans to carry out his execution. Scheduled for June 10, 2025, Hunt is set to be executed by nitrogen hypoxia, a relatively new and controversial method. Nitrogen hypoxia causes death by replacing oxygen in the lungs with nitrogen gas, leading to unconsciousness and death without the pain associated with other methods. While proponents argue it is more humane and less prone to complications than lethal injection, many legal experts and human rights advocates question its ethics and efficacy, as it has never been tested in a U.S. execution before. Interviews with legal scholars highlight the uncertainty surrounding nitrogen hypoxia. Some argue the lack of precedent raises constitutional questions under the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment. Others point to the necessity of finding alternatives due to the shortages and legal challenges associated with lethal injection drugs. Alabama's adoption of nitrogen hypoxia places Gregory Hunt's execution at the forefront of a pivotal moment in American capital punishment history, where tradition, innovation, and ethical debate intersect. As the scheduled date nears, Hunt's story forces us to confront the complexities of justice, the weight of a life taken, and the evolving methods used to carry out society's harshest sentences. Case 2, Anthony F. Wainwright, Florida. Anthony F. Wainwright's story begins far from the headlines of a brutal murder and death row. Born and raised in North Carolina, his early life was marked by hardship and instability. Growing up in a troubled neighborhood, Wainwright faced a childhood shadowed by poverty and limited opportunities. Family struggles and early brushes with the law set a troubled path, one that would ultimately lead him into the prison system. Though details about his upbringing paint the picture of a young man shaped by adversity, the choices he made would soon overshadow any attempt at redemption. By the early 1990s, Wainwright was incarcerated in a North Carolina prison, serving time for previous offenses. Yet confinement did not contain him. In April 1994, alongside fellow inmate Richard Hamilton, he orchestrated a daring prison escape, slipping through the cracks of the justice system. What followed was a violent rampage that crossed state lines, thrusting him into the national spotlight for reasons far grimmer than his escape. On April 27, 1994, in Lake City, Florida, the pair confronted 23-year-old Carmen Gayhart in a grocery store parking lot. With weapons drawn, they abducted her at gunpoint, setting into motion a chain of horrifying events. Over the course of several brutal hours, Wainwright and Hamilton committed unspeakable acts, raping her, strangling her, and finally shooting her twice in the head, extinguishing a young life filled with promise. The law caught up with them swiftly. The day after the murder, April 28, 1994, a shootout with police in Mississippi led to their capture, ending their brief but violent freedom. The trial that followed revealed the full extent of their crime, with prosecutors presenting overwhelming evidence, witness testimonies, forensic data, and the harrowing accounts of the victims' final moments. On June 12, 1995, Wainwright was convicted of first-degree murder. The judge delivering the sentence did so with measured condemnation, describing the killing as pitiless and unnecessarily torturous, and labeling Wainwright's actions as wicked, evil, and vile. The death sentence was carried out in accordance with Florida law, setting the stage for years of appeals and legal battles. Now, after more than 3 decades, Anthony F. Wainwright's execution is scheduled for June 10, 2025. The method, lethal injection, will bring an end to a long chapter of pain and punishment, a somber conclusion to a life that veered far from its troubled beginnings. This case forces us to confront difficult questions about justice, accountability, and the human capacity for both destruction and remorse. Case 3, Stephen Stanko, South Carolina. Stephen Stanko was born in 1968 in Charleston, South Carolina, into a turbulent environment marked by economic hardship, family dysfunction, and early exposure to criminal activity. His childhood was far from stable. He experienced neglect and was raised primarily by a single parent who struggled to keep the family afloat. The instability and lack of guidance shaped much of his early behavior, leading to frequent run-ins with the law throughout his adolescence and young adulthood. By the time he was in his 20s, Stanko had developed a history of violent offenses including armed robbery and assault, resulting in multiple prison stints. After serving time for these earlier crimes, Stanko was released from prison in early 2005, a man attempting to forge a new identity. During this period he portrayed himself as a reformed character and even claimed to be an aspiring author, telling acquaintances and the community that he was writing novels. This facade of rehabilitation hid a dangerous truth beneath, a capacity for manipulation and violent tendencies that would soon culminate in a horrifying crime that would shock South Carolina. In the summer of 2005, the peace was shattered when Stanko was implicated in the brutal murders of Laura Ling and Henry Turner. Laura Ling, a woman with whom Stanko had a complex and ultimately toxic relationship, was found alongside her friend Henry Turner, both victims of an unthinkable crime. The details of the case revealed a grim and disturbing story. The murders were accompanied by sexual assault, and the scene of the crime showed evidence of a struggle, rage, and betrayal. Stanko's ability to mask his violent impulses behind his author persona made the shock all the more profound. Law enforcement quickly moved to apprehend Stanko, and his arrest marked the beginning of a long and contentious legal process. The 2007 trial was a media sensation, with prosecutors laying out a meticulously detailed case against him. The prosecution presented forensic evidence including DNA samples and crime scene photographs, witness testimony describing Stanko's abusive behavior towards Ling, and psychological evaluations demonstrating his dangerous nature. Defense attorneys attempted to paint Stanko as a troubled man struggling with mental health issues and a past marked by hardship, but the weight of the evidence was overwhelming. After days of deliberation, the jury convicted Stephen Stanko of 2 counts of murder and sexual assault, a verdict that reflected the brutal and premeditated nature of the crimes. The sentencing phase was equally decisive. Stanko was handed 2 death sentences along with an additional 110 years for other offenses related to the case. The judge characterized the crimes as cold-blooded and vicious, emphasizing the breach of trust and the cruelty involved. Stephen Stanko is now scheduled to be executed on June 13, 2025, by lethal injection, the method standard in South Carolina's capital punishment protocol. As the execution date approaches, his case has sparked broader discussions about the risks of recidivism and the potential for manipulation by ex-offenders attempting to disguise dangerous behaviors. Mental health professionals who have studied cases like Stanko's highlight the challenges in identifying which released prisoners pose significant threats. They explain how some individuals, especially those with violent pasts, can exploit the system's trust, presenting a false image of reform to avoid detection until it is too late. Case 4, Thomas Lee Gudinas, Florida. Thomas Lee Gudinas was born in 1970 in Florida, raised in a working-class neighborhood that, while stable in some respects, offered limited opportunities and little guidance. His upbringing was marked by the struggles typical of many youths in economically challenged communities: sporadic parental supervision, early brushes with minor delinquency, and a gradual drift toward risky behaviors. Though not widely known for violent tendencies in his early years, Gudinas's background paints a picture of a young man navigating a difficult environment without strong positive influences. On the night of May 7, 1994, Gudinas's path crossed tragically with that of 24-year-old Michelle McGrath, a college student and aspiring professional. McGrath had spent the evening at a nightclub in St. Augustine, Florida, enjoying what should have been a routine night out with friends. As she left the venue late that night, fate intervened in the most horrific way. Gutinas approached McGrath outside the club, initiating what was soon revealed to be a violent and deadly encounter. According to detailed court records and witness accounts, Gutinas abducted McGrath at gunpoint, forcing her into a nearby secluded area. There he committed an act of sexual assault, demonstrating a level of brutality that stunned both the local community and law enforcement officials. The assault escalated to murder when Gutinas strangled McGrath, extinguishing a promising young life in a cold, calculated act of violence. Her body was discovered the next morning near a local school, sparking a swift and intense police investigation. The discovery of Michelle McGrath's body ignited a manhunt for Gutinas, who was soon arrested and charged with first-degree murder and sexual assault. The trial, held in late 1995, became a focal point for media and public attention in Florida, symbolizing the community's outrage and demand for justice. Prosecutors presented a compelling and detailed case, relying heavily on forensic evidence, including DNA analysis linking Gutinas to the crime scene, as well as testimony from witnesses who saw the events unfold or had knowledge of Gudinas's whereabouts that night. The defense attempted to provide context, highlighting Gudinas's troubled upbringing and arguing for mitigating circumstances, including possible mental health issues and a lack of prior violent convictions. However, the jury was unconvinced, and after deliberating for several days, they found Gutinas guilty on all counts. On August 17, 1995, the court sentenced him to death, a verdict that reflected the particularly heinous nature of his crimes. Following the sentencing, Gutinas embarked on a lengthy appeals process, as is typical in capital cases. His legal team challenged the conviction on multiple grounds, including procedural errors and claims of ineffective counsel. These appeals stretched on for more than 2 decades, reflecting the slow and often painstaking nature of the American judicial system when it comes to death penalty cases. The extended duration of Gudinas's time on death row has brought renewed attention to the ongoing debate over the ethics and effectiveness of prolonged incarceration under a death sentence. Experts in criminal justice and victim advocacy frequently discuss how these extended waits affect everyone involved: the condemned prisoner who faces years of uncertainty, the victims' families who endure prolonged grief without closure, and the broader community, which grapples with questions about justice and retribution. For the families of Michelle McGrath, the decades-long wait has been an agonizing test of patience and resilience. As of now, Thomas Lee Gudinas's execution is scheduled for June 24, 2025, by lethal injection, Florida's primary method of carrying out capital punishment. This impending date brings the case full circle, from the tragedy of that May night in 1994 through the complex maze of trials and appeals to this final, irreversible step. Case 5, John Hansen, Oklahoma. John Fitzgerald Hansen, also known as George John Hansen, was born in 1964. While specific details about his early life remain limited, records indicate that by the late 1990s, Hansen had become involved in criminal activities, including armed robberies. His criminal trajectory culminated in a series of violent offenses that would ultimately lead to his death sentence. On August 31, 1999, Hansen and his accomplice, Victor Cornell Miller, initiated a crime spree in Tulsa County, Oklahoma. They carjacked 77-year-old Mary Agnes Bowles from the parking lot of the Tulsa Promenade Mall. Posing as individuals in need, they lured her into her own vehicle. Miller drove while Hansen held Bowles at gunpoint in the back seat. They transported her to a remote dirt pit near Owasso, where Hansen shot and killed her. Gerald Max Thurman, a 44-year-old trucking company owner, was present at the dirt pit making a delivery. He noticed the suspicious activity and contacted his nephew to report the vehicle's presence. Before he could take further action, Miller shot Thurman 4 times with a revolver to eliminate him as a witness. Thurman was found shortly after and taken to a hospital, where he succumbed to his injuries on September 14, 1999. Hansen and Miller were arrested on September 9, 1999, following a robbery at a federal credit union. Investigators linked them to the murders through fingerprints found on Bowles's car and the discovery of the murder weapons, a .38 caliber revolver and a 9mm semi-automatic pistol, hidden in a toilet tank. In 2003, Hansen was convicted of first-degree murder for Bowles's death and sentenced to death. He received a life sentence without parole for Thurman's murder. Miller was also convicted and initially sentenced to death, but after multiple appeals, his sentence was commuted to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Following his state convictions, Hansen was transferred to federal custody in Louisiana to serve a life sentence for unrelated federal crimes. In March 2025, after legal proceedings and administrative approvals, he was transferred back to Oklahoma to face execution. Hansen's legal team filed a lawsuit against the Oklahoma Pardon and Parole Board, alleging bias and conflict of interest, in an attempt to delay the execution. However, on May 7, 2025, the board denied clemency in a 3-2 vote. Hansen's execution is scheduled for June 12, 2025, by lethal injection at the Oklahoma State Penitentiary in McAlester. Case 6, Richard Gerald Jordan, Mississippi. Richard Gerald Jordan, born in 1946 in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, grew up in the nearby town of Petal. Adopted and raised alongside siblings, Jordan was known in his community as a well-behaved and respectful individual during his school years. After graduating from Petal High School, he enlisted in the U.S. Army, serving for 4 to 5 years, including a tour in the Vietnam War. Upon his honorable discharge, Jordan returned to Mississippi, married and became a father to 3 children. He worked various jobs, including managing a fertilizer plant and working in a shipyard in Morgan City, Louisiana. By January 1976, facing financial difficulties, Jordan devised a plan to kidnap someone from a wealthy family to demand ransom. He traveled to Gulfport, Mississippi, and posing as an electric company worker, identified the home of Charles Chuck Martyr, a bank executive. On January 12, 1976, Jordan went to the Martyr residence under the pretense of checking circuit breakers. Finding only Edwina Martyr, Chuck's wife, at home with their 3-year-old son, Jordan abducted her, leaving the child asleep in the house. Jordan forced Edwina to drive into the DeSoto National Forest. There he fatally shot her once in the head. Jordan later claimed that he intended to hold her for ransom and that the shooting was accidental when she tried to escape. However, evidence suggested that Edwina was shot at close range while kneeling, indicating a deliberate execution. After the murder, Jordan contacted Chuck Martyr, falsely claiming that Edwina was alive and demanding a $25,000 ransom. He instructed Chuck to leave the money wrapped in brown paper on a jacket placed on the side of Interstate 10. Authorities later discovered that Jordan had already killed Edwina before making the ransom call. Jordan was arrested shortly thereafter and charged with capital murder. In July 1976 he was convicted and sentenced to death. However, his case underwent numerous legal challenges over the years. His initial conviction was vacated due to procedural issues, leading to multiple retrials and resentencings. Notably, in 1991, a special prosecutor agreed to a life without parole sentence, citing Jordan's exemplary prison behavior, military service, and expressions of remorse. However, the Mississippi Supreme Court later ruled that such sentence agreements were invalid under the law at the time, reinstating the death penalty. Over the decades, Jordan filed multiple appeals, challenging various aspects of his conviction and sentencing. His most recent appeal was denied in October 2024. On May 1, 2025, the Mississippi Supreme Court set his execution date for June 25, 2025, at 6 p.m. At 78 years old, Jordan is Mississippi's longest-serving death row inmate, having spent nearly 5 decades incarcerated for the same crime. Mississippi law permits several methods of execution, including lethal injection, nitrogen gas, electrocution, and firing squad. The specific method for Jordan's execution has not been publicly disclosed. As the clock ticks closer to each scheduled execution, more layers will be revealed, more voices will be heard, and more truths will rise to the surface. Don't let this be the end of your journey. Like this video, share it, and most importantly, subscribe to this channel. Because what's coming next, you won't want to miss. More stories, more impact, and more truth coming soon. So stay tuned, stay aware, and stay with us.